A well-executed example of foreshadowing in your fiction can make a story feel more tense and raise the stakes for our characters. So, how does foreshadowing work, and how can writers use it to spice up their stories? Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life. With Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpan. Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpan.
Hello.
Welcome to the Writer's Gym.
Hello.
Now we are in Reading at Emily Inkpan's house again for
Indeed.
this episode.
Yep.
We've had Tunnock's caramel wafers.
Well, you have. Can we talk about the cheese? The cheese was really
The
exciting.
cheese was very nice.
The cheese was excellent, yes.
Yep.
We've
Holland
had,
and Barrett vegan blue.
we've had coffee. We have Percy Pigs.
Homemade grape jam.
Homemade grape jam.
Yeah, by yours truly.
And all sorts of good things, which we wish we could share with you, listeners. But instead, we are going to share some information about foreshadowing in fiction. And I want to introduce a new word that we will explore later. Well, actually, Emily, I'm going to let you introduce this word.
Absolutely. Yes.
And what is that word? What is our word of the week?
Well, okay, so without context, the word is foreslathering. With context, we were discussing when foreshadowing is done in a very heavy-handed way. You know, when someone says something very, very obvious and, you know, you're like, oh God, you know, clearly that's going to come back later because it's just been said in such a way that it hits you around the head, you know, like a mallet. That is called foreslathering.
We will come back and talk more about foreslathering and the perils thereof.
Yes.
Will we be naming the guilty?
Well, I mean, it's everywhere, isn't it? So it'll be really hard.
I think
And really easy.
And really easy.
I think we will come up with one or two examples because we all know them, don't we? And listeners, you I'm sure will be forming examples in your heads as you are listening. But let's talk about foreshadowing. I know that both of you have used foreshadowing in your fiction, but I think we'll start with Rachel here, but can you just give a definition of what foreshadowing is and why we might use it in our work?
When we talk about foreshadowing, all we're really looking at is imagery, suggestions, symbols, words people say, which the reader the first time around might, or we hope, will consciously not trip over. But when that thing that it's alluding to comes up in the natural time of the novel or short story or script or whatever we're looking at later, it's already put its power in. So it's in a way, foreshadowing is the opposite of deus ex machina, which is when something comes from outside of the universe. Foreshadowing ensures that the reader or listener does not feel like that has happened, that the world is playing by its own rules. That's what's going on underneath. That's why it works. But in terms of what it is, it's a sense of what might be coming. Now, it might be something literal in the plot, or it might be just taking my favourite weather example, because I love Jane Eyre. I grew up on Jane Eyre, and when Mr. Rochester and Jane finally reveal their feelings to each other and he proposes, it's during this very dramatic storm, and we find out the next morning that the very solid, very stoic oak tree in the garden has been struck by lightning and destroyed, and we have the sense of, oh dear, it might look all lovely, but something bad is in the shadows there, which of course it is. But it's not just weather, there's all kinds of ways you can say something is coming.
Well, it's like that's sort of pathetic fallacy, isn't it? When it's like, you know, you're having an argument and there's a storm wailing outside, and maybe when it's foreshadowing, it's like something nice is happening, but the weather is at odds. And yeah, because pathetic fallacy is like when it matches, isn't it? The storm is brewing and there's an argument happening.
And you can, of course, do the opposite and it work just as well. So, for example, I mean, I've done one where it's a funeral on a beautiful sunny day, and that absolutely stabs, you know, rubs it in that this appalling thing is happening and the weather's taking the piss.
Yeah.
Indeed.
At the least it could do.
The least it
drizzle.
could do.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, anything else is just rude.
So I suppose the next question is then, why might we use foreshadowing? What does it bring to our stories? What does it do to our characters, our storytelling, our plot that makes it more dramatic or interesting for our readers?
It's kind of necessary in order to have a sense that it's not just, as Alan Bennett put it about history, one thing after another. You know what that is.
Yes.
It's a way of keeping the reader having a sense that the things are joined up. And like I said, it's probably going to be subliminal on the first reading.
Yeah,
but later
absolutely.
you go back and you notice, oh, that predicted this and this is an echo of that. So it's foreshadowing, and if you want to look at it this way, echoing things that have already happened. It's joined up thinking.
That's exactly what it is. Because the way I look at it is nothing comes from nowhere. So normally when something happens, it's because of a chain reaction somewhere, not as just a random occurrence. You know, if we're telling stories about characters and something happens between the characters, it's because of a long build-up, or it's because of personality traits that have been pretty obvious for a while coming to a head. It's not, I mean, when it's done well, it is not a sudden thing that a character just does, which is out of the blue and, you know, and everything. So you can almost see it coming. It's almost like predicting the weather, isn't it? It's you know.
And looking at the horizon and seeing the clouds coming towards you. You talked, Emily, you talked about a slow boil, didn't you? About what appeals about novels that you can't have in shorter fiction is the slow boil. So there's a lot of opportunity for that in longer fiction, isn't there? Yeah,
there is. Like, foreshadowing is I mean, like, I do a lot of it. One of the fun things about the Dex Legacy is because I wrote the novels first and the audio drama is set 11 years before. So I know where they're going. And as a result, I've got a lot of opportunities to weave in little bits that are going to come back in the novels.
Doing a Star Wars
down the line. Yeah, I mean, like, it's working backwards, obviously, but it's, you know, I know that where the novels begin is not the beginning of their story. A lot has happened in their history to get them to the point where they are at the beginning of the trilogy. And they allude to that. They are constantly looking back to their childhood and to their teen years and talking about what happened. And a lot of the things that led to them being who they are took a long time to establish. And, like, these patterns of behaviour that they've gone through, like, they've been raised in an abusive situation. Abuse doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a long period of time to get the mental processes in place that then last well into adulthood. And in the audio drama, I'm building those up. And people who are listening to it might not notice what's going on at the moment, but they will later on. And that's important. Like, I couldn't not write it, because then it would make no sense when the novels begin. You know, it would be like, oh, when did that happen? Oh, I didn't notice that. You know, like, no, it's all happening all the time in the story.
There is a connection to another thing that we sometimes call Easter eggs in fiction, so that we find something at some point in the future that harks back to something that fans might have noticed in the past. And that probably is really just tying up probably a loose end in a foreshadow or whatever. But I mean, it seems to me then, and I think you've expressed this really well, Emily, is that the foreshadowing, the key thing is that it requires a lot of planning in the way that you write. I
think this is why I think of writing often as layering. You'll have heard the image of it being a statue, that when a sculptor is working on a sculpture, you take away everything that isn't the sculpture from the clay. Yeah. And writing is very much like that for me, that you do your first draft and then you fill in your next layer of detail and you fill in your next layer of detail. So by the time something is of publishable quality or of agent or publisher reading it quality, you will have enough of an aerial view of this thing to have put that stuff in. But I would say if you were trying too hard to stick it in on the first draft, that's when we have that wonderful word that you came up with, Emily, forslathering, where it will feel very heavy, because of course it's going to feel heavy in comparison with what else is there, which at an early stage will be quite light compared with what is coming.
I think the art of it is that people shouldn't notice it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It should be completely missable until the event happens, and then you notice the little breadcrumbs that led you there.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, I mean, you've been talking about layers. I talk about like tapestry and weaving. You are constantly holding threads, and then you're constantly weaving them together and bringing bits in and making sure that there are no loose threads just going off that you've dropped. And one of the things that I would say is that inevitably when you're going through a first draft, you bring in ideas later that need context and need a little bit of foreshadowing, otherwise they'd be completely random. But the thing to remember is that a single sentence here and there is all you need. You do not need to go back and write a whole chapter, or a whole 3 paragraphs in a chapter that will then allude to what happens later. No. A passing comment from one of your characters, a single sentence that exhibits how a character reacts to something that is said, will then be enough that people notice it when it happens and get the significance of it later.
Yeah.
So you do not need to go and do loads. Just go back and go, okay, right, in that conversation, that might have come up, that feeling towards a subject that will then come back in this.
There's trust your reader, which is famous, but there's also light the touch paper and retire, which works just as well. Let the thing do its thing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, there's another view of foreshadowing that I think would require the foreshadow to be noticed in ways that it wouldn't in your example, Emily. And that is the introduction of some tension or portent into the story. A character that's always walking by the river, you might say, I hope they don't fall in one day or whatever. And it just makes you think, oh gosh, I wonder if they will. And it does add that tension, but I think there's an even finer line to be trodden there than in general foreshadowing, between making it seem so bloody obvious that Jack's going to fall in the river and actually just introducing that tension that they might.
There's a brilliant parody. If anybody wants to see how not to do it, there's a wonderful parody in The Young Ones where we just cut to the cockpit of an aeroplane and the pilot says to the co-pilot, wow, I really hope we don't have a crash. Yeah. and bringing the viewer in on the joke of that, because it can feel very, very heavy. And I see what you mean, Chris, that the portents have to be handled carefully. But I guess when it works, you only notice it's worked on the second read or the second viewing, potentially. I mean, I say that's not always true. As you get used to reading, as you get used to watching, I guess you do start to notice. But one that worked on me, and this truly worked on me at the time, and I'm not going to say which novel it is because it's a spoiler for anyone reading it, but there is a Maggie O'Farrell novel in which this gorgeously written love affair between these two people, and he's in a complicated situation and she's younger, and you're absolutely rooting for them and you're rooting for him to get out of the situation, and then he leaves the story quite abruptly. And the first time I read it, when I got to that paragraph, because the paragraph was always saying, need to sort my will out, need to do this, that and the other, just in case, because thank God we got a warning, because just in case. And then he was gone. And I remember my heart leaving my body through my mouth at that point. I had not seen it coming. Now, I think if I read it for the first time this time, it's possible I would. But still, even if I did, the characterisation was strong enough that whether you see it coming or not, it absolutely destroyed me.
Oh, God.
And reading it back, yes, there were signs, and yes, the story of her character arc made certain things necessary, blah, 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 but oh my God.
But the signs can actually make the impact of the thing
Oh, God, I've got such a...
heightened, can't they?
Yeah,
Okay,
of
so
course.
either of you guys seen The Bridge to Terabithia?
Yes.
No.
Oh, my goodness, that movie. There is a moment of foreshadowing before the huge thing, and you're thinking, hold on a second, that could turn out badly or something. And then the actual event hits you like a truck. You are not expecting it at all. I felt kind of angry because this movie was advertised as a kind of light-hearted fantasy movie, about kids, family friendly. Oh my God, I was a mess.
But if they'd advertised it as a movie with a plot twist about an hour and 10 minutes in that will destroy you,
Yeah.
that wouldn't have worked.
No.
would
Okay,
it?
I've got one word for you.
Oh.
Bambi.
Oh, yeah. Finding Nemo. I'm sorry, the opening sequence of Finding Nemo.
Yeah.
Like, I remember I was babysitting one time and the kids had just gone to bed, and I was actually a rubbish babysitter. I always let them stay up far too late. And they, I say that, sorry, any parents who are listening to this, that is absolutely a confession. That definitely happened. But anyway, so I remember I just put these kids to bed and I thought, okay, I'll, put a movie on. And I put on Finding Nemo. It was the opening sequence. I was crying. The parents came in. They came home, and they were like, "Oh my God, what are you watching?" And I was like, "I'm Finding Nemo." Oh God, Coral.
Yeah.
Did you get an R out of them at the time? How did they react?
I can't even remember their reaction. It was my. I couldn't see. I was crying. Yeah.
Well, see also Up.
Oh,
the
yes.
Disney movie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's 4 kids films that we mentioned there, which is
Kids films are the worst. They really come out of nowhere because you're expecting them to be happy, and my God, it's like, okay, like,
and then they just teach them what life is really like. Bastards.
It's like you go and see The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and it opens up in a World War II,
evacuated.
World War I,
World War
evacuating
II. Yeah.
London. And it's
If I go
heartbreaking.
down that track, I will be on a soapbox, and it will be very difficult to get me off the soapbox. So I'm just
Noted.
going to say that Aslan is Ronald Pickup. End of.
Ronald Pickup. Oh,
Yes.
yes. Well, I mean, we'll come back to that,
This is not an argument, this is a fact.
possibly.
This is one for a future episode of the Writers' Gym.
Or the pub,
Aslan is
the pub
Ronald
afterwards.
Pickup.
Yes. Allegorically, it's supposed to be Jesus, isn't it? But we'll edit all of this
Yes,
out.
at least God.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, to C.S. Lewis it was Jesus, but to me it's Aslan, and that's okay with
Yeah,
me.
because it works on different levels,
The main
unlike
line.
the Bridge to Terabithia.
Yeah, which just hits you like a juggernaut and
hits you like
wipes
a
you out.
girl falling off a rope swing.
Oh my God, was not ready.
Going back to the word that Emily invented,
Yep.
foreslathering, the act of over foreshadowing, or more obviously foreshadowing.
It is a brilliant word, well done.
And it
Thank
is a fantastic
Thank
word.
you very much. Yeah, it's where the money's at.
And
I wish.
I think inventing that word is an achievement and an accolade,
Thank you.
really, alongside your British Science Fiction
Thank
Association
you.
award.
Yes, I made myself a little certificate with a gold
Did you?
star on it. I
Very
did,
well
It's
deserved.
on the fridge.
We'll post a picture of you being presented with that.
Thank you. Yes.
And
yes.
the show notes of this podcast. But I think foreslathering, probably the word is humorous in a lot of ways, because I think it's a trap that we could all easily fall into.
Sure.
We've talked about the fact that it's a fine line. Foreshadowing is something that is a delicate operation. So what are the perils of foreslathering, and how can we as writers try to avoid falling into this trap?
I mean, it is taking the surprise element away, and with it, I guess, the sense of reality, that in our interpretation of our own reality, when people say I should have read the signs, we are always, we're moving through time in one direction. Yes, there might be signs in another person's behaviour, but no, the weather probably isn't telling us what's going to happen in the next scene, etc., etc. And with keeping the foreshadowing, keeping the technical equipment that the writer is essentially putting in there not obvious, that allows us to continue the sense of reality for the reader. And if the foreshadowing gets too loud and obvious and self-referential and look at me, look how clever I am, then we lose all sense that this is reality.
Yeah, because we don't read the signs. And quite literally, I've just been thinking about like situations in real life where the foreshadowing becomes foreslathering, and we're very good at this in the UK. Our signposts, our warnings. This is a river with a footpath. Do not fall in the river. Danger.
Yes.
Water. Do not fall in the river. Of course, you don't pay attention to the signs. But then you could argue that anyone who falls in the river, it was very foreshadowed because there was a sign back there saying, do not fall in the river. We
And
actually,
an actual river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually we foreshadow we foreslather and we foreshadow our lives. But I think the act of foreslathering, I think it's more tempting when you're plot driven because you know exactly the plot points that you're moving towards. And if your character is a vessel to get you to those points, then the character is pandering to the plot points as opposed to the plot points pandering to the character. And I think the temptation then is to lead the reader up to those points, those plot points, which are very important and they're going to be very pivotal later on. And that's what you've got to get to. Whereas people go through life absolutely blithely unaware of what's going to happen. People see signs right in front of them and think, well, I'm not the kind of person that reads signs, so I'm not superstitious, not even a little stitious. I won't fall for that. I'll carry on with my life. And then the thing happens. And so what was the question again? There was a question there.
Well, it was just about avoiding the pitfalls.
Oh, right.
You know what, though? It's, in the end, foreshadowing is to make the plot clear and to make the character clear. That's what it's there for. So it's really just like anything successful. It's the swan analogy. It needs to look absolutely graceful on the surface and going like crazy underneath the water. And if you forget that and you try and show the going crazy under the water, again, if it draws attention to itself, then it's stopped doing its job. It's there to support the story, not overshadow it. Foreshadowing is not overshadowing.
Yeah. And do you think there are examples where there are multiple foreshadows? I'm thinking of things like Hamlet's procrastination. It happens over and over again. The boy who cried wolf.
The thing is,
straw
though,
Peter.
I would be careful with those because the definition of tragic hero is that they do not learn their own flaw and they do not grow from it.
And
So
that's not necessarily a foreshadowing.
No, and Hamlet is one of the more popular tragic heroes, and I get why it irritates people, but if you take the indecisiveness and you take what personally I would argue makes Hamlet enormously useful as something to read and watch, which is he's making it about himself. What does this say about me? And the whole thing with writing coaching, but all coaching really is there's the what do I want, what's the thing I'm trying to achieve, and what's all the fluff around it of what I think it says about me. And people who stop there on what does this say about me and don't go to the what is the thing, say the thing, they don't reach that. Now, Hamlet is almost the poster child for what happens if you don't do that. He does get stuck in it. He does get stuck in limbo. He moves between indecisiveness and indecisiveness. And if we do that in our lives, even if we're not all dying on the battlefield, we do end up dead with no change having happened. And that, for me, is the point of tragic heroes, that we, if we don't learn from our experiences, if we don't listen to what it's trying to tell us, we repeat the behaviour. So I think tragic heroes is something a little bit different, whereas foreshadowing is about what is going to happen. If a ghost turns up and says, this has happened, this needs to, and he goes, yes, absolutely, and then doesn't do it, to me that's not foreshadowing. In fact, that's the opposite. That's pulling the wool over the audience's eyes.
Beware the Ides of March.
So Beware the Ides of March is a pretty fair example, isn't it? Caesar, something shitty's going to happen on the 15th of March. You might want to watch yourself. No, the end. Literally. So again, the reason that works is interesting, again, because we're not meant to be going, Julius Caesar in this play is meant to be a really good example of how I should live my life. That is not what these things are there for. No. Any more than Scream is there because you want to think this is how I should live my life. It's more a case of don't walk around with your eyes shut. Don't only see the version of yourself and other people that you want to see.
Don't be fooled by sort of mirrors, holding up imaginary mirrors that are, the eyes of others, making up.
And actually, that is a big Hamlet thing. Is the hold a mirror up to nature. It doesn't mean that just because you can see it's there doesn't mean that you look in it. And that's, again, it's the tragic hero. It's the not learning. So I guess going back to crystallizing the plot or showing character, what that's doing is it's supporting the story that you are telling.
Foreslathering, though. Macbeth, the witches.
Yeah.
Literally at the beginning, opening act.
Very true. And then again,
when the
at the start
hurly-burly's
of
done, when the battle's lost
Korea.
and won, and
Yeah.
that lovely sense that they do not care who wins, who loses. It's just humans doing humany things.
Yeah.
I do quite enjoy that.
But
Yeah.
someone's going to get their comeuppance.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they even say, like, you know, who will be king hereafter and everything, but they even... Don't they even say about it being, like, a bad idea and things are going to go horribly wrong?
Less happy than Macbeth, but much happier.
And
Indeed.
it's like, come on, you know, and then all the stuff unfolds and you're like, you were literally told,
Yeah,
you know.
don't be surprised by this.
literally told that this was going to happen and you didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Emily, you've mentioned that you use quite a bit of foreshadowing. When you do that, what impact do you want it to have on your readers? Do you want them to kind of hark back to the time you foreshadowed an event and go, oh yeah, and admire you as a writer for having done that?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us on the Writers' Guild.
Yes.
Or is there an advantage in their understanding of the story in spotting that? Or is it about building tension? Or
It's about all of those things. It's like it's a D all of the above situation because you need to build up the characters over time for the actions later to make sense. We are all humans. We are all learning all the time, building ourselves up and reacting to things as we go in light of everything that we have previously experienced. That is absolutely the case. What the audio drama, by being a prequel to the novels, is allowing me to do is layer in these moments. They won't be noticed by people who are listening the first time around. Now, I do know I've had conversations with people who listen to the audio drama who have said they listen to each episode at least twice because in every episode there are moments where they're like, well, that's going to come back later. Okay. And it's not necessarily, like often all of this is all tied together, but the fact that they are looking for those things, that sort of tells me that they have already started seeing patterns that are emerging throughout the plot, which is very interesting and probably not at this stage something that I'm doing on purpose. It just kind of happens. But there are episodes which are very, very important for things that happen 11 years later. And something that I've sort of said in the past is that actually one of the most important episodes of season 1 is an interlude, and it's a single scene. And people probably won't realise how important that scene is until, you know, much, much later. Is
there something in that where something is very significant and important? Sometimes those are the things that are woven in more deeply that are readers. So the example that is in my head, in my first collection, in Beyond Glass, the 2-part story is called The Other Woman. And it begins in the head of one of 2 twins, and she feels like the rubbish sister, basically. And the other's got the same face and the same body, but still manages to walk tall and know what to do with her hair and her life. And this one, whose head we're in, has just got out of a massive domestic violence situation in which somebody has died. And by the end of the second part of the story, what a couple of different people have said to me is, oh, I'd forgotten that there was... I can't do this without implying spoilers here, but they'd forgotten something fundamental about that first scene that meant when there is a little bit of symmetry of somebody else who maybe deserved it more, not coming to a very happy ending in part 2, they'd forgotten certain details there. And that has always interested me because it's not, I would argue, the subtlest thing I've ever put in a piece, but because they are engaged with the characters, they've carried on with those characters, and then they've read the other stories, and then at the end of the book they get to part 2 of this story because it bookended it. And I've had quite a few examples of people going, didn't see that coming at all. When it is probably the most slathery that I have been.
The most slathery.
The most for slathery that I am conscious of having been,
Yeah. It's interesting how that can happen, isn't it? I mean, for me, I'm like, well, this episode, you won't notice the significance until later. Because even though it's the seed for everything that starts to build up and happen, they won't know that until stuff kicks off, until it actually comes to a head and builds. I don't think these things necessarily have to be subtle at the time. They just have to not mean something at the time and not be obvious that they mean something at the time.
That's it. They need to feel like just a nice detail about the world.
Yeah.
That you go, oh yeah, good, and carry on.
Yeah, exactly. And like moments where a person, we were joking about this earlier, is like, you know, oh, look, it's my mother's locket that means a lot to me. I hope I don't lose that later. You know, that is ridiculous.
Classic foreshadowing.
Classic foreshadowing right there. And that is basically saying, this is an event that's happening now, and this could happen in the future. And leaving it at that. That is obvious that it's going to come back later.
Wouldn't it be terrible if this happened in the future?
And it's like, it's the idea, it's like prophesizing. I think that's it. It's the nature of prophesizing in a book. If you're prophesizing that something might happen, that is dangerous. You've got to just go, okay, this is happening right now.
Going back to the Shakespeare examples, the Winter's Tale, when he doesn't believe that his wife has not been unfaithful, so he asks the oracle, and then the oracle says, dude, she hasn't been unfaithful. So he says, right, the oracle is lying, I will now make some very bad decisions. And everything happens because he's refusing to see the perfectly clear signs, hence the rest of the plot.
Yes. Yes. Well, see also Othello to an extent as well, actually.
Yeah, but that's much more deliberate. Leontes does it to himself, whereas Othello is massively betrayed by the person. He's Iagoed. Yeah, and actually those stories where it is the person that person considers the most trustworthy source, the friend, and this is something that I do find quite, not spooky, but chilling, is that thing about whatever the person has as their security blanket is the thing with the most power over them. The thing that makes them feel most like themselves is actually sometimes the thing that is most likely to be their undoing.
Yeah.
And that friendship is a wonderful example of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes I actually find that it's like when somebody's, oh God, there's no foreshadowing like following the hero's journey absolutely perfectly into the letter, because you know, if you've been writing a while, I know a lot of people who aren't writers can watch things absolutely fine, not know what's going to happen, not know the function of all of these characters and everything and how they're going to turn out. For me, I'm sitting there watching something and I'm like, okay, I know exactly who's going to betray who at some point, and I know exactly what's going to happen next, because it's following the hero's journey, Campbell's hero's journey, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah. It's just
different Campbell.
It's just following
Joseph Campbell, not the soup.
Yes, it's following that format to the letter. And for me, I mean, I don't know if that's spoilers or foreshadowing. I don't know.
The 1,000 faces that Campbell advertises might not feel like 1,000 faces.
No, in certain situations, in certain storytelling, in certain dramas and everything, it's just so ABC.
I mean, any tool is only a reflection of the person that's using it, the style, whether it suits them or not. It doesn't mean the tools don't work, it just means don't think that the tool is more important to your writing than you are.
There are tools and devices, aren't there, around foreshadowing, and the classic one would be, you know, don't show a gun in Act 1 unless you're going to fire it by the end of the play. I think that was Chekhov, is that right?
I think it was Chekhov.
Yeah.
And the thing is that these are great techniques to play with, but as I said, you know, it's only as useful as it is to you in your writing. Do not put the cart before the horse.
Yeah. And because those things are so well used and so cliched, I think they become examples of foreshadowing, don't they? If you know, if the camera drifts across a room and we see the handle of a pistol underneath a cushion or something, deliberately half hidden, that's a pretty blunt
take something like, there's brilliant storytelling with that in Inside Number 9 in their most recent ones, where, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it yet, go and watch it and then come back to the rest of the sentence.
Always watch Inside Number 9.
Absolutely.
Really.
I will try and not spoiler on this, but there is a gun, but by the time the inevitable gun inevitably goes off, you've rethought how you feel about both people and who is the real victim and what's going on so many times that it's not spoiling it for you because it's keeping you guessing about the characters. So character is always the answer, really. You know, it's all about your relationship with them, the layers that you unpeel in order to see what's going on between them.
Yeah.
It's never, the gun is never about the gun is about the people holding the gun.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're coming towards the end of this episode. Is there an exercise or a challenge for us in foreshadowing? Hopefully not in
Coincidentally,
foreslathering.
I have one written here.
Ah, excellent.
What are the odds? Here's what I am daring you to explore this week, or play with this week. I like saying play with. It reminds us this is a toy shop, not an exam room every time you write. Your character ignores a feeling or a sign. Take that wherever you want it. Here's a second one, if you want more. Take the same object. Put the object in 3 scenes in a person's timeline. See how its importance or apparent lack of changes if you move forward through time or maybe back through time.
Very nice. So that's introducing the point in a plot that something becomes apparent as an aid to the foreshadowing, I guess.
It can be, but I think that it is enjoyable enough and vague enough that you won't feel like you're being led by a tool. You'll be being led by your characters, and that will help you know how you want to use the tools.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
I also like the way you talk there about how important it is or how not important it is. Because I think there's a certain amount of, some people are looking for signs. Some people look for signs and they look for patterns and then see patterns everywhere. And it's then sometimes in a story that this person will fixate on a particular pattern and then things will just hit them unexpectedly because they weren't actually paying attention to what was going on.
That's
They were
a decoy foreshadow.
Yeah, I guess so. But it's the
Wow.
kind of, but again, it comes back to character, doesn't it? And the kind of character that you are, like you're dealing with. Are they the kind of character to fixate? Are they the kind of character to look for things? Are they the kind of character to fixate in the wrong direction and, not notice what really matters to them and to others around them?
You're getting your readers to look in a different place, aren't you?
It's the, what's that over there? Kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meanwhile.
Meanwhile,
Yeah.
In
Twin
reality.
Peaks.
Well,
Yes.
as you can probably hear, listeners, this is a conversation that has intrigued us quite a lot. I'm sure we will continue it in a pub at some point very soon. But as always, thank you for joining us on the Writers' Gym today. And as always, from Emily Inkpen,
Thank you very much.
Rachel Knightley,
Thank you very much.
and from me, Chris Gregory.
Oh, he said his own name. He did. He said his own name.
I broke a rule there, didn't I? I actually said my own name. I don't think that's in my contract. I don't think I'm allowed to do that, am I?
There is no contract, just saying
There's no
this to
contract.
the listeners. So let's-
Okay.
in case this all stays in.
He said his own name all by himself.
I know.
Bless him.
He's growing
I'm so
up.
proud of him. Episode 18, and he said his own name.
Bye, Lulu.
Bye, everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Writers' Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writers' Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writers' Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for the Writers' Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.